The river smelled of wet stone and crushed marigold, and the lanterns were already moving. Sylvie Bramwell stood ankle-deep in the shallows at the far bend of the Ashwater, where the current slowed and the bank curved inward like a cupped hand, and watched the lights drift past. Hundreds of them. Paper lanterns shaped like open palms, each one carrying a candle stub and a folded prayer, released upstream by families gathered at the main festival grounds half a mile north. She could hear them from here. The drums, the singing, the high, bright laughter of children chasing each other through the market stalls. The sound carried beautifully over water. She wasn't up there. She hadn't been up there in a year. The 3 lanterns she'd made sat on the flat rock beside her, unlit. She'd folded them herself that morning at her kitchen table, cutting the paper with her grandmother's sewing scissors, the ones with the worn brass handles that still smelled faintly of lavender and thread. 1 lantern for each year since Nan had gone. The first she'd released last spring, alone at this same spot, her hands shaking so badly the candle had almost tipped before the water took it. The second she'd made 6 months later on the night of the winter solstice, because the grief had surged up so suddenly she'd needed somewhere to put it. The third was tonight's. She crouched and struck the flint. The candle caught on the second try, a small brave flame that trembled in the breeze coming off the water. She cupped her hands around it until it steadied, then set the lantern on the surface and gave it the gentlest push. It floated, wobbled, caught the current and began to drift, joining the slow procession of lights moving downstream like a river of fallen stars. Sylvie pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose. She would not cry. She had cried enough. She had cried on the morning she'd found Nan's chair empty and cold, and on the day they'd buried her in the meadow behind the cottage, and on every single night for the first 3 months when the house was so quiet she could hear her own pulse in the dark. A year of grief had worn grooves into her, had reshaped her the way water reshapes stone, slowly and without mercy. She was harder now, smoother, smaller in some essential way she couldn't name. She reached for the second lantern. "That's a good spot." Sylvie's hand jerked. The lantern tipped sideways on the rock, and she caught it before the candle could roll free, her heart slamming against her ribs as she turned toward the voice. A man stood on the bank behind her, tall, broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested the kind of strength that came from use, not vanity. He wore a simple dark blue long-sleeve tunic with the sleeves rolled to his forearms and dark trousers tucked into boots that were already wet at the soles, as though he'd been walking along the river's edge for some time. His hair was a rich brown that caught the lantern light in warm tones, falling just past his ears and pushed casually to one side, and his eyes, she couldn't quite name the color. Cool blue-gray, like river fog at dawn, like the sky just before it decides whether to storm or clear. They were watching her with a kind of careful attention that made her stomach tighten. Not predatory, not pitying, something else. Something she didn't have a word for. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, with a roughness at the edges that softened when he spoke. He held up both hands, empty. "I was just looking for a quiet stretch." Sylvie straightened. Her fingers were still curled protectively around the lantern. "There's a 1/4 mile of riverbank between here and the festival grounds. Most of it's quiet. Most of it doesn't have lanterns." She stared at him. He smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, but it changed his whole face. Made the sharp angles gentler, made the cool eyes warmer. "I brought one," he said, and reached into the satchel at his hip to produce a paper lantern, slightly lopsided, clearly handmade. "But I've never done this before. I was watching the families upstream and realized I have no idea what I'm doing." Something in her chest shifted. A tiny fracture in the wall she'd built. She ignored it. "You fold a wish inside, light the candle, and set it on the water. That's all. What kind of wish? Whatever kind you need." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the 2 remaining lanterns on the rock beside her, and at the single light drifting downstream, already small and distant, and something flickered across his face. Recognition. Not of her, of the ache. "May I?" He gestured to the bank beside her. Every instinct she'd honed in the past year said no. Said pull inward, stay small, keep the grief private because sharing it meant letting someone close enough to leave. But the word that came out of her mouth was different. Yes. He stepped into the shallows. The water reached his ankles, same as hers, and when he moved to stand beside her, something happened that Sylvie could not explain. The current changed, not the river's current. Something deeper. Something inside her chest. Like the slow pull of a tide she hadn't known existed, drawing her gently, insistently, toward the man standing 3 feet to her left. Her skin prickled. Her breath caught. The sensation was like standing at the edge of the sea and feeling the water tug at her ankles, patient and relentless, asking her to come further in. She took a step sideways, away from him. The pulling didn't stop. It just stretched, like a rope going taut, and the absence of closeness felt like wading against a current. He was looking at her. Those blue-gray eyes had gone very still. "Do you feel that?" he asked quietly. "Feel what?" "The river isn't pulling that direction." He nodded downstream. "But something is." Sylvie's pulse was hammering. She set her jaw. "I don't know what you're talking about." He held her gaze for a beat longer than comfortable, then looked away. Nodded once, as if accepting her answer even though they both knew it wasn't true. He crouched beside the water and set his lopsided lantern on his knee. "I don't have a flint," he said. She handed hers over without thinking. Their fingers brushed. The tide surged, warm, insistent. A current of something golden running up her arm and settling behind her sternum like a second heartbeat. Sylvie snatched her hand back. He didn't flinch, just struck the flint, lit the candle, and held the lantern cupped between his palms. "What do I wish for?" he asked. "Something you want." "And if I don't know what I want?" She looked at him, really looked. Past the broad shoulders and the fog-colored eyes and the easy, unhurried way he held himself. There was something underneath it. A tiredness. A loneliness that he wore the way she wore hers. Like a coat so familiar she'd forgotten she could take it off. "Then wish for clarity," she said. "That's what Nan always told me. When you can't see the path, wish for better light." His expression softened. "Nan?" "My grandmother." The word scraped against something raw inside her. "She taught me to make the lanterns." He didn't say he was sorry. Didn't tilt his head with that particular look that people gave her in the village, the one that was equal parts sympathy and discomfort. The one that said, "I don't know what to do with your sadness, so I'll just make a face and hope you stop talking about it." He just nodded and set the lantern on the water and let it go. They watched it drift together. 2 lights now, hers far ahead, his just beginning its journey. "I'm Declan," he said. "Sylvie?" "Sylvie." He said it slowly like he was tasting the shape of it. "Will you light the other 2? She looked at the remaining lanterns on the rock. 2 left. One she'd planned to release now. The other she'd been saving for the walk home, for the private moment on the footbridge behind her cottage where no one would see her face crumple. "The second one is for tonight," she said. "The third is for later." "May I watch?" She should have said no. Should have told him this was private. That grief was not a spectator sport. That she came to this bend in the river precisely because no one else did. But the tide was pulling gently at her ribs, and his voice was warm, and her hands were cold, and the loneliness of the past year had settled into her bones like frost that wouldn't thaw. "Fine." She lit the second lantern. This one she'd written on. A single line in her grandmother's language, the old tongue that Nan had whispered lullabies in and cursed weeds in and used for every prayer that mattered. Sylvie held the lantern between her palms and closed her eyes, and for a moment she was 12 again, standing at this same river with Nan's hands over hers, learning how to let the water carry what was too heavy to hold. She set it down, watched it go. Voice breaks. She sounds remarkable, Declan said softly. She was the only person who ever... Sylvie stopped, pressed her knuckles against her mouth. The sentence was too dangerous to finish. The only person who ever stayed. The only person who ever made the house feel like somewhere instead of nowhere. The only person who looked at Sylvie and saw someone worth knowing. Declan was quiet. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to fill the silence with words. He just stood in the water beside her and let the current move around their ankles and waited, patient as stone, for the wave to pass. It did. Eventually. They always did. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For not saying you're sorry." "I am sorry, but you already know that. You don't need me to perform it." She looked at him sharply, and something cracked a little wider in her chest. Who was this man? Who waded into a river in good boots and stood in silence with a stranger and understood instinctively that grief didn't need a response, just a witness? "Would you like to walk?" he asked. "The lanterns are heading downstream. We could follow." Pauses. "I shouldn't." "All right." He didn't push, didn't look hurt. He just stood there with the water around his ankles and the festival lights reflected in his fog-colored eyes, and waited. And the tide pulled, and pulled, and pulled. "Fine," she said again, "but I'm keeping the last lantern. Wouldn't dream of taking it." They walked downstream along the bank, following the slow procession of lights. The festival music faded behind them, replaced by the sound of water over stones and the occasional low call of night birds in the willows that draped their branches toward the current like women washing their hair. The grass was damp underfoot. The air smelled of smoke from the festival bonfires and the sharper, cleaner scent of wet earth and river moss. Declan walked beside her with an easy, ground-covering stride that he shortened to match hers without being asked, and the pull between them became something almost rhythmic, like a second current running parallel to the river, tugging gently every time one of them drifted too far from the other. Sylvie was acutely aware of the space between their arms. 6 inches, then 4, then 6 again when she corrected. He asked her about the lantern tradition. She told him what Nan had told her, that the river carried grief to the sea, and the sea was big enough to hold anything, and if you gave your sadness to the water with an open hand, the water would give you space in return. He listened the way she imagined the river listened, quiet and absorbing, without interruption. She was a healer, Sylvie added, surprising herself. She hadn't talked about Nan to anyone in months. The village had stopped asking. An herbalist. She ran the apothecary on Mill Street for 40 years, delivered half the babies in the valley, knew every plant that grew between the river and the ridge, what it could cure, what it could harm, what it was good for if you just left it alone. And you learned from her. Everything I know. She ducked under a low-hanging branch. I run the apothecary now. Or I try to. She made it look effortless. For me it's... She shrugged. It's work. The things worth doing usually are. She glanced at him. There was no condescension in his voice. No inspirational platitude. Just a man stating something he appeared to believe. Plainly, the way you'd say the river is cold or the moon is bright. He told her that he'd come to the festival alone, that he hadn't attended one in years, that someone on his council had suggested he get out of the keep, and he'd agreed mostly because the alternative was another night staring at treaty documents and trying to remember the last time he'd done something that wasn't a duty. Council, Sylvie repeated. Keep. He looked sideways at her. I may have left out some details. What kind of details? The kind that tend to make people behave differently around me. The pulling in her chest stuttered. She stopped walking. The river moved on without them, carrying its lights downstream, and the willows whispered, and somewhere in the distance the festival drums beat a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. Who are you? She asked. He turned to face her. The moonlight caught his jaw, the line of his throat, the quiet resignation in those blue-gray eyes. My name is Declan Trevane. I'm the Alpha of the Western Province. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Sylvie's mind went blank, then screaming, then blank again. The Alpha King of the Western Territories, the man whose name was spoken in the village with a mixture of reverence and nervous laughter, the man who controlled the border treaties and the grain subsidies and the military outposts that kept the valley safe. That man was standing in a river beside her in wet boots, holding a lopsided homemade lantern he'd clearly never made before in his life. She took a step back. The tide protested, pulling hard, and she gritted her teeth against it. You should have said. Would you have let me stay? No. The answer was immediate and honest, and she hated it. That's not the point. It's exactly the point, Sylvie. Her name again, spoken with that same careful weight. I didn't come down here as the Alpha. I came down here because I saw a woman releasing lanterns alone at the edge of a festival, and I understood it. Not the tradition. The aloneness. Her throat tightened. You don't know anything about my aloneness. I know what it looks like from the inside. His voice was rough now, the controlled edges fraying. I know what it feels like to stand in a crowd and feel the distance between yourself and every other person like a physical wall. I know what it's like to lose someone and have the whole world expect you to be finished grieving on a schedule that has nothing to do with your heart. She stared at him. My mother, he said quietly. 4 years ago, she was the last person who called me by my name instead of my title. Pauses. Until tonight. The crack in Sylvie's chest split wide open. She didn't move toward him. Not yet. The stubbornness that had kept her alive through a year of grief, that had kept her running the apothecary alone and tending the garden alone and eating dinner alone at a table set for one because she couldn't bear to remove Nan's chair. That stubbornness held her in place like an anchor dug into mud. But the tide was stronger. I need you to understand something, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. I don't need rescuing. I'm not a lost thing waiting to be found. I chose to be down here alone. I've been choosing it every day for a year because it's safer than the alternative. And I need you to know that before I what? Before you stand there looking at me like I'm something worth wading into a river for. His jaw tightened. Something raw passed through his eyes, quick and unguarded, and then it was gone. You are, he said simply. But I'm not here to rescue you, Sylvie. I'm here because the river brought me downstream and you were standing in it. She wanted to argue, wanted to shove the wall back into place and send him away and go home to her quiet cottage and her quiet table and her quiet, careful, survivable life. But her feet wouldn't move, and the tide was pulling. And something Nan had said once, years ago, sitting at that same kitchen table with the sewing scissors in her lap, rose up in Sylvie's memory like a lantern catching the current. The bravest thing isn't holding on, love. It's opening your hands. Walk with me to the bridge, she said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thinner, more honest. I'll show you where I released the last one. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. A light, small and careful, like a candle flame in cupped hands. Lead the way. The stone footbridge behind her cottage was old enough that moss had softened every edge. It arched over the narrowest part of the Ashwater, where the current quickened and the banks drew close, and from the center you could see both upstream and down, the whole glittering trail of festival lanterns stretching like a road made of light. Nan had brought her here every year since she was old enough to walk, had held her up on the railing when she was small, so she could watch the lanterns pass beneath them like bright fish. The stone still held the warmth of the afternoon sun, even this late, and Sylvie rested her palm against it the way she always did. Hello, I'm here again. Declan stood at the foot of the bridge and waited. He hadn't stepped onto it yet. Sylvie looked back at him and understood. He was giving her the choice. This was her place, her ritual. He wouldn't enter it without permission. She held out her hand. He took it, His palm was warm against hers, calloused across the fingers in a way that spoke of sword hilts and reins, and the tide between them settled into something deep and calm, like a river reaching its widest point. Sylvie set the last lantern on the railing. Her hands were steadier now. Something about his presence beside her. Not comforting exactly, not fixing anything, just there, had settled the trembling she usually felt at this part. "This one's different," she said. "The first two are for grief. This one is supposed to be for hope. Supposed to be. Nan always said the third lantern should carry something you're reaching toward, not something you're letting go of." She stared at the unlit candle. "I haven't been reaching toward anything in a long time." Declan leaned against the railing beside her, close enough that the tide between them hummed, warm and steady, like a river running underground. "What would you reach toward if you could?" She thought about it, really thought, for the first time in months. Not about what she needed. Herbs to dry, a leaking roof to patch, a garden that needed weeding. But what she wanted. "I want to stop being afraid of the quiet," she whispered. "The house is so quiet without her, and I've been filling it with work and routine and telling myself that's enough. And it is enough. I can survive on enough, but—" Voice breaks. "I don't want to just survive anymore. I'm so tired of just surviving." She felt his hand near hers on the railing, not touching, just close enough that the tide pulsed between the gap, warm and aching. "Then wish for that," he said. She struck the flint. The candle bloomed. She closed her eyes, folded the wish into her chest where no one could see it. "I want to be brave enough to let someone in," and set the lantern on the water. It caught the current immediately. Faster here, where the bridge narrowed the flow, and the lantern sailed downstream like it had somewhere to be, joining the procession of lights, becoming part of something larger. Sylvie watched it go. Then she turned and kissed him. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't planned. She turned and his face was right there, close enough that she could see the individual shades of gray and blue in his eyes, and the tide surged, and her hands came up to his jaw, and she kissed him before she could talk herself out of it. His hands found her waist. Careful. Warm through the linen of her blouse. He didn't pull her closer, just held her steady, and kissed her back with a tenderness that broke something open in her chest that she'd been bracing shut for a year. The tide between them went calm. Not pulling anymore, just present, surrounding them, like slipping into warm water and finally letting yourself float. She pulled back. His forehead rested against hers. She was trembling, and she didn't care. "You're shaking," he murmured. "I know. Is this all right?" "I don't know." Honest. Terrifyingly honest. "I haven't let anyone close to me since she died. I don't know how to do this anymore." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "Then we learn. Slowly. At whatever pace the river sets." She almost laughed. "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me, and it's also deeply impractical. Rivers flood. I'll build higher walls. That's the opposite of what I need." He did laugh then, low and warm and startled, and the sound of it moved through her like sunlight through glass. "Fair point. No walls. Open doors. Better? Better." They stood on the bridge as the festival lanterns drifted downstream, and the moon rose higher, and the night deepened around them like water closing over their heads. He told her about the keep, and the weight of a title he'd never wanted, and the council meetings that made him want to walk into the river himself. She told him about the cottage, and Nan's garden that she'd kept alive out of stubbornness more than skill, and the way the house creaked at night in exactly the places Nan used to walk. They talked until the last lantern passed beneath the bridge. Then they stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, and watched the dark water carry the light away. "Come to the keep," he said. Not a command, a question wrapped in a statement. "Tomorrow, let me show you the garden. It's a disaster. My groundskeeper quit 6 months ago, and I've been pretending I don't notice. You want me to come to the Alpha's keep to look at a dead garden? I want you to come, because the tide is going to pull us toward each other whether we're in the same room or not, and I'd rather be somewhere with chairs." She looked at the river, then at him, then at the cottage behind them, dark and empty, and waiting to swallow her back into its quiet. "Tomorrow," she said. He walked her to the cottage door. He didn't try to come inside. He stood on the step and looked at her like she was the last lantern on the river, and she looked at him like he was the current that had carried it, and the tide between them hummed, low and steady and patient. "Good night, Sylvie." "Good night, Declan." She closed the door, pressed her back against it, listened to his footsteps fade on the garden path. The house was quiet. The same quiet it had been every night for a year. But for the first time, it didn't feel like drowning. 3 months later, the marigolds were winning. Sylvie knelt in the dirt of the keep's south-facing garden. Her garden now, though she still startled sometimes when the staff called it that, and pulled a weed from between 2 rows of lavender that had no business being this healthy in early autumn. The beds were overflowing. Chamomile and echinacea and feverfew and rosemary, all the healing plants she'd transplanted from Nan's garden, now thriving in the richer soil and longer sunlight of the western slopes. She'd built a drying shed beside the kitchen wall. She'd started teaching the cook's assistant how to make tinctures. She'd planted marigolds along every border because Nan had always said they kept the bad things out. They were spreading. Nan would have approved. "You have dirt on your face." She looked up. Declan stood at the garden gate with 2 cups of tea, wearing the expression he always wore when he watched her work. Soft, wondering, like he still couldn't believe she was real. "I always have dirt on my face." "I know. I like it." He handed her the tea and sat beside her on the stone edging, his shoulder pressing against hers. The tide pulsed once, warm, settled. It didn't pull anymore. Hadn't pulled in weeks. It had become less of a current and more of a steady presence, like a river that had found its course and no longer needed to search. "The council approved the herbalist quarters," he said. Sylvie froze, the cup halfway to her lips. "The full proposal? With the teaching rooms?" "With the teaching rooms. And the supply budget you asked for." He took a sip of his own tea. "Brennan argued for an hour. I told him that the woman who resurrected a garden, the groundskeeper declared clinically dead, could probably manage a classroom." She set down the cup and looked at him. Really looked. At the tired eyes and the careful smile, and the man who had waded into a river in good boots, because he'd understood, without being told, that grief was not something to fix, but something to stand beside. "Nan would have liked you," she said. The words came easily now. The name no longer scraped. It rang, clean and bright, like a bell. "I would have liked her. You talked to her portrait, you know, the one I hung in the study. I've caught you twice." His ears went red. It was her favorite thing about him, the alpha of the Western Province. The man whose name made border generals sit up straight, blushed when she caught him being tender. "I was asking her advice." "About what?" "About you." He set his cup down and took her hands, turning them palm up, studying the dirt under her nails and the calluses from the garden shears. "I asked her how to deserve you." Sylvie's breath caught. What did she say? "Nothing. She's a portrait." He grinned when she smacked his arm. Then he lifted her hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, one at a time, slow and deliberate. "But I think she would have said to keep showing up. So I am." Pauses. "Declan." "Sylvie. I released a lantern last week. From the bridge. Just one." His expression changed, gentled. "You didn't tell me. I wanted to do it alone. Not because of the grief." She turned her hands in his so their fingers laced together, dirt and all. "The 3rd lantern. The one for hope. I wanted to release it again because last time I didn't actually make a wish. I was too afraid to name what I wanted. And this time?" She looked at their joined hands, at the garden blooming around them, at the keep rising warm and solid behind him, full of rooms she was slowly learning to call home. At the morning, she woke to his footsteps in the corridor and the kettle already on the stove. At the evening, she spent in the study, drying herbs on racks she'd built herself while he read correspondence aloud and asked her opinion on territorial grain yields, which she gave because her grandmother had understood soil and seasons better than any nobleman alive, and Sylvie had inherited every scrap of that knowledge. At the man who had never once asked her to stop grieving, only asked if he could grieve beside her. "This time I didn't need to wish," she said. "It already came true." He pulled her into him and she went, pressing her face into his neck, breathing in the smell of him. Wood smoke and river water and the chamomile she'd been drying in the study that had seeped into everything he wore. His arms wrapped around her, strong and steady, and she felt the tide between them settle into something permanent. Not a pull, a belonging. The river had found the sea. In the bed behind them, the marigolds swayed in the autumn breeze. Gold and bright. Stubborn little things, keeping the bad things out, just like Nan always said they would.